Before he died, Johnny Carson told the audience that 9 of his guests were gay. Johnny Carson let people into his living room every night for 30 years, giving the impression that he was close with Hollywood's biggest stars. But while the cameras were rolling and millions of people watched at home, the famous host of The Tonight Show was hiding shocking secrets that would have ended the careers of his most famous guests right away. A director who used to work with Carson on The Tonight Show and said, "Johnny knew everything," said this. Stars would come on the show, charm the crowd, and talk about their relationships and marriages. Johnny would just smile, knowing that the whole public image of the star was a carefully constructed lie. He died knowing most of these lies. Carson became more honest with his close friends and family about the complex lies he had seen throughout his life in his later years. During his work, he wrote a lot about pop stars who were loved but lived double lives for decades, hiding their real selves behind studio-arranged marriages and carefully made public images. The most shocking thing he said was about America's most romantic leading man, the heartthrob who sat on Carson's couch several times to talk about his marriage while terrified that the host would ask one question that would reveal his whole life as a studio-made lie. He also talked about the famous Hollywood couple whose 26-year romance was hailed as the movie industry's greatest love story, even though Carson knew it was all part of a plot to hide their sexuality from an angry public. It wasn't just general information or talk about the business. In a time when being caught meant losing your job, being shamed in public, and maybe even being charged with a crime, these were matters of life and death. It's hard to carry around these interview secrets when you know they are fundamentally dishonest. Weighed heavily on Carson as he thought about his reputation in his later years. But first, let's look at the most shocking discovery. This is how America's most wanted leading man kept up a complicated lie through a studio-arranged lavender marriage while living in constant fear of being exposed on TV's most-watched talk show. This is how the score adds up. You are the only thing that matters to me. Rock Hudson is a hot guy who has a fake wife. In the 1950s and 1960s, Rock Hudson was the dream man for millions of American women. Because he was tall, good-looking, and charming, he became one of Hollywood's most bankable love leads. He played opposite Doris Day in comedies that made him look like the perfect straight man. A former writer for The Tonight Show who knew Carson's private thoughts said the irony was amazing. Johnny was interviewing the guy that women all over America dreamed about night after night. Hudson knew that his whole public image was a carefully constructed lie meant to hide the fact that he was gay, but he still went on Carson's Tonight Show many times, charming viewers with his good looks and stories about his time in Hollywood. But people close to Carson say that these visits caused a lot of stress behind the scenes for both the host and the guest. Hudson was gay, Carson knew that. A former NBC official who worked closely with the Late Night Show said it was a well-kept secret in Hollywood, but he also knew how bad it would be. Hudson's work would be affected by the attention. Both men were very aware of the landmines around them during every conversation, so they had to dance carefully around the truth. Given that Hudson was a love lead, the pressure on him was especially high. Hudson's success was built on the fact that he was attractive to women who believed in the straight image that Universal Studios carefully crafted. This is different from character actors who might be able to handle rumors about their sexuality. A film expert who specializes in the golden age of Hollywood said that this wasn't just about privacy. His director, Henry Wilson, planned his whole life, including his marriage to Wilson's secretary, Phyllis Gates, to protect the made-up image that made Hudson famous. Things could not have been more important. Gates was married to her for only 3 years, from 1955 to 1958, but the marriage did its job of putting an end to the rumors. There were whispers that Hudson was gay. People who knew Carson well say that the host found these studio-arranged lavender marriages to be especially upsetting parts of Hollywood's star system. A friend of the Late Night Show for a long time said that Johnny called it institutionalized lying. He didn't think anyone's sexuality was wrong, but he was disturbed by the complicated systems used to trick people. As a person who interviewed people for a living, having to take part in these lies worried him more than people thought. Hudson's sad double life came to an end when he died of complications from AIDS in 1985. He was one of the first famous people to die of the disease. Because of his illness and death, the world had to face his sexuality in a way that he had spent his whole career trying to avoid. It was Carson. A writer who worked on The Tonight Show during this time said that Hudson's death had a big impact on them. He thought Hudson was stuck in a system that wouldn't let him live an honest life, and as he got older, he thought that his part in keeping up these lies was becoming more and more problematic. This complicated connection between public image and private truth would come up again and again in Carson's thoughts about the people he met in Hollywood. Not more dramatically than when he told the truth about one of the most sophisticated leading guys in movies. "Where are you going to live?" "Albany." "You mean Albany? Have a family up there?" "That would be my mom." Almost. Gender roles and expectations. A writer who worked with Carson said that Carson had a lot of respect for how Hepburn had found a way to be somewhat real in a system that was meant to make people conform. She had learned how to live a respectable life despite the limitations of her time, which he thought was a truly admirable feat. This tension between public image and private reality would come up again when Carson thought about a star whose intense acts might have been caused by the stress of having two different lives. "Thank you, but it's hard to see. Please play it again." "Marlon, I mean you, we knew you were in town." The open secret about Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando changed the way actors were seen on screen with his raw, realistic roles. He became one of the most important actors in movie history with his part as Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire and later in movies like On the Waterfront and The Godfather. Sources who knew Carson's private talks say that the host was fascinated by the contrast between Brando's reputation for being brutally honest on screen and the way his personal life was presented. A former Tonight Show producer said that Carson met Brando several times and always found him to be very difficult. There was an actor who was praised for always telling the truth in his roles. At the same time, though, he was keeping important things about his private life from everyone. Especially about his sexuality. Brando built a reputation as a straight, dangerous actor by having affairs with women that got a lot of attention and getting married several times and having many children. Carson, along with many other people in Hollywood, was said to have known that Brando's private life was much more complicated and fluid than his public image suggested. A writer who worked closely with the show said, Johnny would say something about the irony. People praised Brando as the start of a new, more honest way of acting. The person who took the fun out of performance. He told big lies about who he really was and who he loved in his personal life, though. Brando became a little more open about being gay as he got older. He said in interviews that he had had sexual relationships with guys. But when he was at the height of his fame in the 1950s and 1960s, this part of his life was carefully hidden by studio publicists who focused on his marriages and straight relationships. Getting along. A friend of Carson said that the late night show saw Brando as someone who had found a lot of balance. He made up enough of a traditionally male character to keep people from looking too closely at him while slowly pushing the limits of what was acceptable. It was a smart way to get around in a dangerous cultural setting. Hollywood was full of rumors for years about Brando's connections with other male stars, like James Dean. People who know Carson's writings say that the host was especially interested in how these connections affected the development of American ideas about what it means to be a man on screen. A former NBC executive said that Johnny thought it was interesting that Brando and James Dean, two actors who changed what it meant to be an American man on screen, were both supposedly in relationships that would have shocked the fans who looked up to them. He found it both disturbing and telling that there was a big gap between how people saw the culture and how things really were. Carson would keep thinking about this idea of image versus reality as he wrote about another famous rebel whose short career was surrounded by stories about how he got ahead in Hollywood. A real miles-per-hour timer set at 1067. James Dean, the job he paid for. While he was only 24, James Dean died in a car accident. He was in only 3 big movies. But his roles in East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant made him a societal icon that will last for a long time. The perfect example of a troubled teen whose dark intensity spoke to a generation of teens looking for real feeling in a time when everyone else was trying to fit in. People who know Carson say that the show was. What he knew about the young actor's rise to fame made him feel especially bad. Carson never talked to Dean. A former staff member who heard the host's private talks said, he died before Johnny took over The Tonight Show, but he heard a lot of stories about him from people in Hollywood. Things that bothered him were the persistent claims that Dean had dated powerful men in order to improve his career. There were a lot of rumors in Hollywood, both during and after Dean's short life, that the young actor was pragmatically bisexual and willing to have sexual relationships with powerful people in the industry as a way to get ahead in the tough competition for lead roles. A writer who worked with Carson said that Johnny would talk about how these accounts of Dean's strategic use of relationships were different from the public picture of him as the ultimate rebel who was honest, uncompromising, and true to himself. He thought it was a very dark example of There is a Secret Bachelor Hall by Cary Grant. Cary Grant set the standard for what it means to be an educated man for generations of moviegoers. His perfect style, British-American accent, and romantic relationships with some of Hollywood's most beautiful women made him the perfect ladies' man, and this image lives on in popular culture decades after he died. A former NBC official who knew about Carson's private comments said that the host had a lot of respect for Grant's skills. But the difference between Grant's public image and private life really stood out to him. Behind closed doors, this man, who literally wrote the book on style and grace, was living a very different life. Carson was most interested in Grant's long-term living situation with fellow actor Randolph Scott, who was best known for his roles in westerns. For 10 years, they lived together in a beach house in Santa Monica that Hollywood insiders called Bachelor Hall. They were married, but no one knew about it. When both Johnny and Grant were at the top of their careers, Johnny would tell the story of how he had to pretend he didn't know about Grant's friendship with Scott, which was a writer who worked closely with Carson. It seemed strange to him to talk about Grant's weddings. He had 5 relationships in his life, but he knew that his relationship with another guy was the most important one. What was so interesting about the Grant-Scott connection was how public it was while being officially denied. They weren't really hiding. There were pictures of them working out, making meals, and relaxing at home together that were published in fan magazines. The pictures definitely showed them as a domestic partnership rather than a couple. More than just friendship. A friend who talked about Hollywood history with the host said, Carson found those publicity photos very interesting. They showed the 2 men in bathrobes eating breakfast, working out, and relaxing by their pool together. Pictures of a couple that we would know right away today. Still, the companies were able to make them look like bachelor buddies who shared costs. Throughout his career, Grant carefully crafted his public image by getting married 5 times to different women. History buffs have said that these marriages, especially Grant's, are classic cases of lavender marriages. Relationships that are mostly meant to keep up a public image of being straight while hiding same-sex relationships. A former Tonight Show writer said that Carson really understood how hard this was on people's minds. He knew that Grant had created a whole performative personality. Archibald Leach, who was born a man, created the Cary Grant character to help him get through a hostile world that wouldn't accept him as he really was. Carson never talked about Grant's sexuality in public, but in private conversations late in life, he was said to have said that he felt bad about having been a part of the machinery that kept up these lies, the talk shows, magazines, and publicity machine that made up stories about stars that had little to do with reality. A longtime friend said that Johnny thought his show was part of a system that made people like Grant live fake lives. That conflict between fun and profit, between public story and private truth, got worse for him as he got older. Thought about his work life. Carson's revelations about one of Hollywood's most famous relationships would bring up this theme of public fiction versus private truth again. A famous couple that the host knew wasn't at all what the public thought it was. Let him go by himself. I just want to make it clear that I mean that men can do many things. The 26-year lie about Katharine Hepburn. One of the most famous love stories in Hollywood is the one between Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. A 26-year relationship that has been presented in books, documentaries, and movies as the perfect example of a committed relationship, even though Tracy wouldn't divorce his wife. But, according to people who knew Carson's private talks, the host knew that their relationship was much more complicated than the romantic myth. A former Tonight Show staff member said that Johnny had interviewed Hepburn several times and grown to really admire her. He did find it interesting, though, how enthusiastically people had accepted a story about her relationship with Tracy that had big gaps in the truth. Carson privately shared with close friends and family near the end of his life that he thought Hepburn and Tracy's relationship was mostly good for both of them because it kept their jobs going while avoiding questions about their sexual orientations. Hepburn and Tracy's relationship served more than one reason. Carson's close friend remembered him saying, "For Tracy, a Catholic who wouldn't divorce his wife, it was a socially acceptable reason for his separation without the scandal of dating. Carson had noticed that Hepburn's closest and oldest relationships were mostly with women. For her, it explained why such a beautiful woman stayed single, while also giving her a lot of freedom to live her life the way she wanted to. She lived with Laura Harding, who was said to be her partner, for a long time. After that, she dated Phyllis Wilburn for decades and called her wife, according to some biographers. A historian who talked about these issues with the late-night host said that Carson found it most interesting how the Hollywood publicity machine had turned what was basically a close friendship and professional partnership into the greatest love story of the century. It might have been the most successful myth-making job in Hollywood history. Tracy's drinking and long breaks gave Hepburn a lot of freedom, while her love for him during his last illness solidified the story of their great marriage in the public eye. The deal gave both stars cover while making a story that is so interesting that it continues to hide more complicated facts about their lives. A former co-worker said that Johnny would always point out how great Hepburn's plan was for keeping her privacy. Instead of going on dates or getting married that were set up by the studios, she mostly avoided the Hollywood social scene and built a life in Connecticut and New York that was away from the constant attention of the movie business. The Tracy relationship